This is a really special occasion. If this were 70 years ago, it would be like being able to get together with Omar Bradley or George Patton or Dwight Eisenhower. In these last nearly 14 years of conflict, General McChrystal has been at the heart of our campaigns and the beginnings of really the world's first great war between nations and networks. And some of us have been worrying, thinking about this, that this age of technological change was going to empower networks. And you found yourself in Afghanistan not once but twice, in Iraq. And you became one of the principal voices for trying to transition our own forces away from the vertical hierarchies to flatter organizations. As our SOCOM chair, Colonel Amir, put it a little while ago when you first briefed, when he listened to you, he heard you say, we're going to become flat and we're going to become fast. I'd like you to talk a little bit about your efforts to create this kind of transition against our very nimble enemies.
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to back up just a little bit to give you a background, because I don't want everybody to think that here I'm this transformational visionary leader, because that's not me. I grew up in the military. I had some experiences. I spent a lot of time in the Rangers and JSOC, but some conventional units. So on 9/11, I was a brigadier general who'd been one for 6 months, I think. And I was an organization guy. I mean, the reality is I'd learned what the Army had taught, and I'd learned the processes that worked. I'd learned the things you had to do to be successful, at least to a certain degree. And while that's good on the one hand, that's also got a downside to it, because you become very wedded to what the doctrine says, you become wedded to what the processes are, you know what's rewarded, you know what's not rewarded, and whatnot. And the first Gulf War, one of the things that you can analogize it to, Saddam Hussein put his army on a golf tee and let us come up with a driver and just pound it. I mean, he did everything possible to advantage what we had been building to fight in Europe and then to fight in the Mideast. And so we walked away with all these lessons that said, well, we got it right. Here we go. And we really, through the 1990s, I think, despite Bosnia and whatnot, we were still reinforced that that was the right answer. And to be honest, I wasn't a leading proponent of that, but I was a product of that. And so I was put in command of JSOC in the fall of 2003, October, and I went over to Iraq, and we were doing what we did tactically very well. We're doing these high-value target hits, and we're going out at night, and we're having great success, but the war keeps getting worse. And so my sense was it would sort of not matter if we had a high batting average at the end of the game if we lost. And so we're going to have to change. And so the first thing we had to do is create this sense initially among certain members of the command, because you need a group of people who help you change it. One person doesn't change anything. We had to create a consensus among opinion leaders to change, and then we had to start to galvanize everybody that we as a group were going to have to figure out what we were going to do.
And part of that change had to do with creating a physical network of smaller outposts, and then social networking with the Anbaris. And you got a lot of them to switch sides and give information. And for those who have or haven't studied the campaign, the way the general cleaned up Baghdad with a relative handful of operators and helped to create a momentum that then became a laboratory for the larger force, yes, which began to follow these methods.
Well, we were part of it. I certainly wouldn't want to give myself or us more credit than we deserve. A lot of people did a lot of things, but what we did differently than when we started. When I first started, we had like 15 or 17 bases around Iraq, and at each base you'd have a small group. You'd have a group of operators, maybe 20 operators, one intel person, one communications person, and they'd theoretically be linked back to this headquarters we had right outside of Baghdad at the airport there. And on paper, this looks great. You got this network. And so I go to visit some of these headquarters, and I go up to the one in Mosul and to Tikrit very soon after I got there. And I go there, and they got about 20 guys, and they got one communicator, one intel person, and I say, okay, show me how you're doing this. And they had very limited physical bandwidth. They had a computer with a satellite link. They could send email, but they couldn't send imagery. That's too much bandwidth. They couldn't do video teleconferences. They couldn't do that sort of stuff. And with one communicator and one intel person, they didn't have the time to digest a lot of intelligence from the headquarters we had, nor did they have time to really produce a lot and send it forward. So what happened is they became self-contained little fighting entities, fighting the war as they saw it. Now, they were doing brave work, but they couldn't see anything more than they could see. And as a consequence, you really had almost no link back to this headquarters we have that thinks it's controlling this thing. We would capture somebody, and we'd capture their computer, their phone, documents. We'd send it back to the headquarters, and the link would be broken. So the people who captured it said, okay, we're not going to get any intel out of interrogations there. We're not going to get what happened because the connections weren't there. So they didn't worry too much about it, and the people down here operated without context. So what we had is, instead of a network of a number of places fighting together, we had 15 or 16 different fights, and I would argue that was true across other organizations as well. So we had to fix it. That the reason we had to fix it was not as obvious to me at first. When we first went over there to look at the enemy, I had studied the FLN, the campaigns against that. I'd studied all the traditional terrorist organizations. Yeah, Algeria. And in a traditional terrorist organization, your focus is on surviving. And so there's compartmented cells that operate in a hierarchy. And so that they can have a focused, disciplined effort, they've got a pretty tight level of command and control, but they communicate very slowly because they've got to do it in ways that they can't be detected. That makes them effective, but it makes them ponderous and slow. And so what you expect from a terrorist organization is periodic activity with a fair amount of precision and effectiveness, but not a lot of agility and not a lot of adaptability. What we saw was the exact opposite. So we're looking for this, and what we're seeing in Iraq was this constantly adapting, agile organization that not only was adapting, what was happening in Basra was affecting what was happening in Mosul. And you could see them connect in that way, and you go, well, how do they do that? That hierarchy can't do it. We kept looking for the hierarchy, we couldn't find it, and finally what we realized is we were looking for the wrong thing. What they were was this network, not by design. I don't think they ever got together and designed it. I think it grew organically. And the reason they could do this, and no group in history had been able to do it like this, is because we dominated most of the technology in Iraq. We dominated night vision, we dominated global positioning systems, we dominated unmanned aerial vehicles, and we dominated precision strike. We also had information technologies. You know, we had cell phone, we had internet, but so did they. And we discounted that at first. We thought we were going to have those other four technologies, and then the internet was going to connect us. We're going to be this dominant network. But they had it as well, because they had it over the commercial networks. And because that was the strong thing that no terrorist organization ever had before, they just organically used it. They passed information. They'd do a car bombing somewhere. They'd film it while they did it, and they'd get it on the web within hours. And so the effect of a car bombing, instead of just scaring one group of people who's close to it, it scares people cities away. And so terror, which is designed to scare you, suddenly scares people hundreds and thousands of miles away and motivates people in other parts of the region to say, hey, these guys are a powerful organization, I have to go join. So we're against a completely different enemy, but it took us a little while to figure it out.
Didn't Zarqawi always send a videographer to these attacks to make sure?
Most vehicle attacks were 3 vehicles. A lead vehicle led the way, the hapless car bomber, and then the film vehicle.
Yeah.
And that would get up literally in hours. And much of it would be produced outside of Iraq. Yeah. So they could do it digitally, send it outside of Iraq, produce it, send it back in all.
And of course, ISIS is absolutely a AAA organization when it comes to these informational strategies.
Yes,
we'll talk more about them. We want to get to questions soon. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about Afghanistan, in particular the challenge of leading a 40-plus nation coalition in another of those difficult strategic tasks. Say a few words about that, and then we'll wrap up this first part of the conversation with your thoughts on the current ISIS situation, and then we'll open it up to questions. Sure. Afghanistan first, General.
Yeah, the first thing about Afghanistan is to understand we went in the fall of 2001, looked like it was going to be really hard in the first few weeks, and it looked like it was going to be really easy, and then we sort of took our eye off the ball, didn't have very many troops or actually much level of effort in Afghanistan for a number of years. The Taliban, for lots of reasons, weakness of the Afghan government and other things, were able to regenerate and come back, and they were able to leverage frustrations at the village level. And so by 2009, when I took command in Afghanistan, you had this difficult situation where the Taliban are back and they're now strong. The Afghan people are frustrated and have lost confidence because they had expected this tremendous improvement in security and economics and governance, and it was maybe unrealistic, but what they'd gotten was far less than that. There'd been progress, but they'd gotten far less, so they were frustrated. They'd seen a number of leaders get back in power at different levels, warlords that they didn't like, and so they're concerned. The Pakistanis had become convinced that we're not serious, and so the Pakistanis had made the conclusion that the U.S. isn't going to see this through, so they're calculating. And the 45 nations that were in the coalition, and it varied by nation, but most of them had come because the United States had asked them, and they had come to do peacekeeping or some version of that. Suddenly we're in something that's a war, and it's ugly. And so it's like a frog being boiled. It had boiled slowly, and suddenly by the summer of 2009, we got a very difficult situation. We're trying to tell political constituencies in 45 nations, this is going to be harder than you thought it was going to be. We're trying to tell the American leadership who thought Afghanistan was the essential war, but it wasn't going to be too bad, and now it was worse. And so we've got this crisis in confidence. And that was the biggest problem. The problem was all of these different parties were no longer confident that the West, led by the U.S., could or would see this through. And so when people are unconfident, they hedge their bets. And the people hedge their bets, you name it. And it's hard to get people committed to a complete outcome when they're doing that.
Is that a similar problem to Iraq today? Is there a sense of not being in for the long pull or not being in deep enough to be able to deal? Because let's face it, ISIS may be a network, but they've grabbed territory, trying to hold it. If we had a will to go after them, we're hell on wheels at knocking out people who want to hold territory. Yeah. So what is the problem there? Is it the similar lack of confidence?
Well, I think it is. I think it's starting to be a lack of American credibility. And what I mean by that is, and I'm not blaming this on anybody, this has been plenty of time building up. But if your enemies don't fear you and don't think you're going to stay the course, then they're willing to put up with it for a long, long time. If your friends don't think that you're absolutely going to be there for the long haul, again, they calculate that way. And I think that we watched the behavior of the Saudis recently. They're behaving in a way that would never have happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But again, it's been over time. So the American credibility and sense of resolve and sense of ability to do things is less than it was. And it's going to have to be rebuilt. But it's not going to be rebuilt by a speech or a paper. It's going to be rebuilt by patient, long-term action. I think the problem with ISIS is it's not a problem in itself. It's a problem in context of a region that's falling apart. The region lacks a political narrative. If you think about it, if you were a young person in the Mideast right now, you have ISIS on one hand, and then what's the opposing narrative? In some cases, it's return to the status quo. You might not like the autocratic dictatorships you saw. Return to something else. There's just nothing that nobody's rushing to a narrative that is credible and compelling enough to get them to fall in. So there's nothing in opposition to ISIS except a group of sort of disparate entities that aren't really yet an alliance.
One of the great business executives in American history, Alfred Sloan, talked about decentralized operations and coordinated control. Your whole theme is about coordinated operations, but decentralized control.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of the theory of the industrial age under Frederick Winslow Taylor and others was that somebody knew best, and you could get the best practice, you could figure it out at some level, headquarters level, and then you could issue very detailed instructions. And if you issued detailed instructions that all fit together, the cogs fit together right, you could get great outcome. You could synchronize and whatnot. And we used to, in early days of my military career, we used to try to do that at pretty high level. You're synchronizing air and ground and all these things as you're moving at high speed. And that's difficult to do if it's centrally controlled. Look at the First World War as they tried to march barrages in front of advancing infantry. And So what happened was, I think that process, which is very tempting, tempts us now, because now we have more information systems. You got 2 cell phones, 3 computers, you got all this stuff you can see and hear. I could sit in my command center and watch every operation we were doing across the entire region at once, from Predator downlink. So I could watch it in real time. I could listen to them over through our radio system, which gives you this illusion that you understand and you have the big picture, and therefore you can micromanage. But you can't. And the reason you can't is because things are now going at a pace and with interconnectedness that the level of complexity is just going through the roof. And so as a consequence, the big difference between what Alfred Sloan was saying, this centralized coordination and control, what I think you have to do is create a nervous system in which the organization informs itself constantly, not just occasionally, just this constant pumping of information across the command like a human brain, but then execution has got to be both decided on and executed at a very local level, near the problem. And the reason is, no matter how good you are, there's no way to get it fast enough to get information from down here, go up through a decision-making process, make a decision, implement down, because things have changed. You've got to near it. You've got to get it right close to where it happens, but you can't just tell people, all right, you're empowered to go execute, go down there, unless you empower them with this unprecedented level of information. We call it shared consciousness. It's transparency at a level that gives people contextual understanding. When I took over JSOC in 2003, we had this daily VTC with about 50 people in it, 25 at my rear headquarters at Bragg and 25 forward. By 2005 and 6, we had the same VTC was now 90 minutes long every day, and it had 7,500 people in it. It's like going to the huddle with a quarterback. The whole command for 90 minutes talks about what's happening, what happened last night, what's happening right now, what are we going to do, what do we need to do. Everybody walked out of there understanding they didn't need more instruction on what to do. They knew what we're trying to do, and they just execute. And then you come back, because I also, when I first took command, our plan was for me to approve every mission. And we were doing 4 a month, 1 a week, so I could handle that. By the summer 2006, we were doing 300 a month in Iraq alone, and more elsewhere. There was no way. And nor should I have tried. I wasn't smart enough to be value added on those. And so what we did was create an environment where they do it. And my role changed to really being an orchestrator of the conversation.
The 2015 National Security Strategy identifies the current conflict with ISIS as requiring a coalition effort and investment in Israel, Jordan, and our Gulf partners in order to enable them to deter aggression while recognizing the sometimes competing imperatives among member states and multilateral institutions. In your personal experience, how can we best take a leadership position in order to break through these competing imperatives, sir?
You remember that what Napoleon said when he was asked what enemy he would most like to fight. He said a coalition. And that is the challenge right now, because if you look at the interests of the main players, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the government of Bashar al-Assad, Iran, Israel, they all have an interest in ISIS going away. But a little like the end of the Second World War, there's also an eyeball on what happens after ISIS disappears. Because I view ISIS, as I described earlier, as this phenomenon that sort of grew in the cracks between the sidewalk because the sidewalk's so badly cracked now. And so our problem is each of those those nations, and there's some groups that probably fall into this kind of bin as well, all have differing views of what needs to happen in the region, differing views of what the framework is going to be going forward. I think if the United States is going to have some kind of strategy that will be beneficial for the long term, we need to start with a political framework. There needs to be something put down and agreed upon, and it's not going to be exact, it's going to be loose, by the key nations in the region that says, this is where we're trying to go. ISIS is a problem in the interim, but this is what we're trying to go. This is how we think the region's going to look like 10, 15, 20 years from now. And you're not going to be able to go further than that because it's just too hard to see. But there's got to be some political goal for which they're fighting. Think of the Sunnis in Western Iraq. Right now, it's a very amorphous goal. They don't really like ISIS, but they don't trust their own government. They don't want Shia militia in. And so what are they going towards? I mean, there are so many young people in the region like that. So I think it starts with American help in developing a political framework. And I don't want to say this would be easy, but I would say that this has got to be the foundational event. And then I think we've got to stay involved. I agree with the decision that we shouldn't own this fight. We shouldn't be the entity providing all the ground forces or anything like that. But I think there's going to have to be a communication that the ISIS problem is going to be solved, but it's not going to be solved in the way that, like Afghanistan, when we pulled out right after or we slowed our support right after the Russians left in 1989. I think we've got to convince people our goal is for that political framework. And we're going to stay engaged to that point. That's hard to communicate to the American people. That's hard to communicate to others. It's much easier to communicate, we're going to drop bombs on these people because they're really evil. But that's almost a distraction in my view.
Okay, to the general's point about coalitions and Napoleon, quiz question. How many coalitions did it take to finally bring him down? Anybody? Any votes for that? 7. It took 7. So that's why he loved being up against coalition. He just wrapped them upside the head. Well, we're at time here. I hope all of you take a moment to have a sense of history about this and remember this time. I spend a lot of my time reading the memoirs of and looking back in history at the great masters of the art of command. You've just spent an hour with one of them in our time, whose works will be read not just 20 years from now, but 200 years from now. And these ideas, I think, have been profoundly shaping in terms of military affairs. And for that, we thank you for sharing all of your thoughts with us. I know there's a little more of an agenda this afternoon with our foundation here, but please take a moment with me to thank General McChrystal for his time with us.
You were amazing. Thanks so much.